The lecture hall was a theater of power, though only one actor believed he owned the stage. Professor Aldous Crane, with his tailored suit and voice sharpened from years of unchallenged authority, commanded the room as if it were his kingdom. Students scribbled furiously, terrified to miss even a pause as he dissected the reign of the last great queens of Egypt. His eyes narrowed, however, when a single hand remained defiantly raised at the back of the hall. "Professor Crane," said Eliza Marlowe, her voice steady but small against the echo of his authority, "there is evidence suggesting another queen, one deliberately erased from history. What if—" The professor's laugh cut through her words like a blade. It wasn't warm or paternal. It was cruel, dismissive, the kind of laugh meant to reduce the speaker into silence. "Miss Marlowe," he sneered, "this isn't a sandbox for fairy tales. Our discipline requires rigor, not wild fantasies." The class erupted in nervous laughter, but Eliza's face burned crimson. Inside, though, something flared hotter than humiliation, a vow. As the room settled, she sank into her seat, her pen motionless on the page. Her mind, however, raced. She had always felt like an intruder in this world of ivory towers and academic pedigrees. She wasn't the daughter of professors or diplomats. She was the granddaughter of a grizzled field archaeologist whose tales of Egypt had once lulled her to sleep. While others studied to preserve reputations, she studied to prove something to herself, and perhaps to him. Professor Crane's thoughts were less generous. Another arrogant student playing explorer. They never last. The sands of Egypt will swallow her fantasies just like they swallowed countless fools before her. He turned back to his notes, satisfied that the hierarchy had been restored. But Eliza could not forget the sting of his words. That evening, back in her small, cluttered apartment, she opened her battered notebook, tracing the faded ink of her grandfather's sketches. He had always whispered of something missing in the records, a queen whose legacy had been intentionally buried. Eliza had dismissed it as bedtime embellishment. Now, after the public ridicule, the fragments of his stories re-emerged with new clarity, whispering louder than Crane's laughter. Her grandfather's voice seemed alive in her memory. "History is written by those who fear the truth, Eliza. But stone never lies. If you know where to look, the sand will tell you secrets it has hidden for millennia." Eliza gripped the pages, her chest tightening. Could it be more than a family legend? The irony wasn't lost on her. Crane had mocked her theory in front of everyone, but it was his dismissal that rekindled the fire her grandfather had sparked years ago. The humiliation, raw and fresh, twisted into determination. She would not allow her ideas to be trampled into dust. Not this time. In that moment, she made a silent promise. She would find proof of the forgotten queen, not for Crane's approval, but for her grandfather's memory, and for every student who had ever been silenced under the weight of arrogance. The night stretched long as she pored over old letters and maps, tucked away in an aged leather box. Her grandfather's words were cryptic, but one phrase struck her like a lightning bolt. "Beneath the sands of Saqqara, where queens are forgotten, lies the one they feared most." Her pulse quickened. Saqqara, the necropolis of ancient kings and queens, had been excavated countless times. Yet her grandfather had hinted at something overlooked, something hidden in plain sight. She whispered into the silence of her room, her voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "If you're right, grandfather, I'll find her." The humiliation she had endured that morning now pulsed like fuel in her veins. The laughter of the professor echoed in her ears, but alongside it rose another sound, the imagined voice of her grandfather, urging her forward, urging her to prove that history was more fragile and more explosive than the world wanted to believe. As the first light of dawn crept into her window, Eliza closed the box with steady hands. Her journey had begun, though she didn't yet know that every step would bring her closer to a truth so staggering it would force even the proud Professor Crane to choke on his own laughter. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Professor Crane's life. The wheels of destiny had been set in motion, and Eliza was no longer a quiet student. She was the keeper of a secret one buried in the sands of Egypt, waiting to be unearthed. The journal was not where she expected it to be. Eliza had searched every corner of her grandfather's belongings after his death, but what she found now was hidden in plain sight. Inside a weathered copy of The Histories by Herodotus, his favorite book, there was a false bottom, the paper edges yellowed but sturdy. Beneath it, bound in cracked leather, lay a journal. She froze, breath caught in her chest, as though she had stumbled into a chamber herself. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The ink had faded to sepia, but her grandfather's meticulous handwriting danced across the pages. Sketches of hieroglyphs filled the margins, symbols she half recognized from her studies. Between the notes, scattered phrases burned with urgency. Queen erased, name struck from stone, burial hidden at Saqqara. They feared her legacy. Eliza pressed her palm flat against the page. "You weren't telling bedtime stories," she whispered. Her voice cracked, carrying the grief of his absence and the awe of discovery. She flipped page after page, her eyes widening at hastily drawn maps of excavation sites. There were notes about chambers discovered and abandoned, areas dismissed by archaeologists as insignificant. Her grandfather had circled one site in bold, almost desperate lines. A forgotten shaft on the southern edge of Saqqara, half collapsed, marked in red ink with a single word: her. Her heart pounded. This was more than speculation, this was obsession. And if his instincts had been right before, perhaps this time he had unearthed the secret no one else dared to see. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Am I just seeing what I want to see? She remembered Crane's sneer, the classroom full of laughter. The humiliation replayed in her mind, but now it warred with something stronger. What if he was wrong? What if grandfather was right? That night, she sprawled across her desk, notes scattered like desert sand around her. She copied every detail from the journal, trying to piece together the puzzle. Some sketches showed a cartouche partially erased, the royal oval that usually bore a pharaoh's name. In its place was only a trace, as though someone had deliberately scraped it away. Beside it, her grandfather had scrawled, "A queen they feared, struck from history." Her throat tightened. To erase a ruler's name was to condemn them to oblivion, a second death worse than the grave itself. Whoever this queen was, her enemies had wanted her forgotten forever. Hours slipped by. Candlelight flickered as Eliza leaned over the journal, lost in her grandfather's words. He had written of whispers among locals, rumors of treasures sealed and cursed. He had written of Crane's own mentor, a celebrated Egyptologist, dismissing the shaft as rubble. Blind arrogance, her grandfather had scribbled angrily. Stone does not lie. The sand remembers. At last, exhaustion forced her to pause. She closed the journal gently, as though it were fragile as a relic itself. She pressed it to her chest, her heartbeat steadying against the cracked leather. In that moment, she felt her grandfather's presence more vividly than ever. A storm of thoughts churned inside her. She had the theory. She had the evidence, at least enough to chase the trail. But she lacked resources, funding, and credibility. Crane would dismiss her in an instant if she presented this. And yet, she could hear her grandfather's voice in memory. History belongs to those who dare to write it. Eliza sat back, staring at the dim ceiling of her apartment. She felt the weight of a choice pressing down on her shoulders. If she followed this, she would risk everything. Her degree, her reputation, her future. She could be branded a fool, just like her grandfather had been in his final years. But if she walked away, if she allowed Crane's laughter to silence her, then the Queen's story, the truth would remain buried forever. She opened the journal again, her eyes drawn to one final note at the back, hastily scribbled in her grandfather's shaky hand. "Eliza, if you find this, promise me you won't let them erase her." Her breath caught, tears blurring the ink. It wasn't just a discovery. It was a legacy. A torch passed down to her, whether she was ready or not. By dawn, the decision was made. The journal was tucked into her bag, her suitcase half packed at her feet. Cairo was waiting. The sands of Egypt were calling her name. And somewhere beneath them, hidden in the bones of Saqqara, a queen long forgotten was waiting to rise again. The heat of Cairo struck her like a wave, the kind that clung to the skin and refused to let go. Eliza stepped out of the cab, clutching her grandfather's journal against her chest, as if it might evaporate in the desert air. The city buzzed with noise, vendors calling, horns blaring, tourists weaving through narrow streets, but beneath the chaos, she felt the hum of history, as if every stone whispered secrets too old for human tongues. She checked into a modest hotel near the Egyptian Museum, her room small and window cracked to the sounds of the street. Spreading her belongings across the bed, she opened the journal once more, studying the sketches with the desperation of someone searching for oxygen. One map in particular drew her in. It was crude, layered with lines and symbols, but when she overlaid it against a tourist map of Saqqara, the pieces began to fit. Her grandfather had marked an area dismissed in official records, an unstable shaft that had caved in decades earlier. Most archaeologists had deemed it worthless, too dangerous, or already plundered. But he had written a single note beside it. "Look at the stars." Eliza frowned, tracing the cryptic instruction. The words puzzled her until she remembered his stories. He often said the ancients aligned their tombs with constellations, believing the heavens guided the souls of kings and queens. She grabbed her laptop and pulled up an astronomical chart of ancient Egypt. When she compared the star alignments to his sketched map, her breath caught. The shaft, overlooked and abandoned, lined perfectly with the star Sirius, the star of Isis, goddess of queenship. Her heart raced. This wasn't coincidence. It was design. That night, Eliza wandered into the streets of Cairo, her thoughts swirling. Lanterns glowed above cafes, where men smoked shisha and debated politics. She overheard fragments of Arabic, French, English, all languages mingling like the crossroads of civilizations the city had always been. She felt small, an imposter among scholars and travelers, yet a current of determination pushed her forward. She sat at a cafe table, scribbling notes. As she did, an old man in a linen cap shuffled past, pausing when he saw the sketches. "Saqqara?" he asked, in accented English. Eliza looked up, startled. "Yes, I'm studying." The man's eyes narrowed, as if weighing her honesty. "Many go there. Most come back with sand in their shoes. Nothing else." His voice dropped lower. "But you look like someone chasing ghosts." Her pulse quickened. "What if the ghosts are real?" The man chuckled, a sound half amusement, half warning. "Be careful, miss. Saqqara hides more than it reveals." With that, he moved on, leaving her staring at the fading crowd. Back in her hotel room, she stared at the ceiling, Crane's laughter still echoing in her mind. Fairy tales, he had called them. Yet the evidence stacked higher with each clue. The alignment with Sirius, the erased cartouche, the journal entries, it all pointed toward one conclusion. She whispered aloud, as if to steady herself. "This isn't fantasy. This is truth." Her grandfather's voice lingered in her thoughts. The sand remembers. By dawn, she had charted a path from Cairo to Saqqara. She knew the excavation teams worked in the northern sectors, far from where her grandfather's map pointed. That meant she could slip past unnoticed, but it also meant she would be alone. Packing the journal, water, and a small flashlight, she caught her reflection in the cracked mirror by the door. Her hair was pulled back hastily, her eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness, but beneath the fatigue burned something unshakable. She wasn't here for Crane. She wasn't even here for herself. She was here for the queen they had buried twice, once in stone, once in silence. As the taxi wound its way into the desert, the city faded into dunes and ruins. The horizon shimmered with heat, and the step pyramids rose in the distance like jagged teeth against the sky. She clutched the journal tighter, her resolve solidifying with every mile. Eliza didn't know what she would find at the site. She didn't know if the shaft would even be accessible. But she knew one thing with certainty. She was closer than anyone else had ever dared to be. And somewhere beneath the desert floor, a queen was waiting to be remembered. The dunes stretched out endlessly, a barren sea of shifting gold beneath the punishing sun. Eliza shielded her eyes as the taxi sputtered away, leaving her alone on the outskirts of Saqqara. The step pyramid of Djoser loomed in the distance, its weathered tiers like the bones of time itself. Tourists clustered around the main entrances, their guides pointing toward restored chambers and reconstructed tombs. But Eliza's path veered sharply south toward the forgotten edge her grandfather had marked. Her boots sank into the sand as she trudged forward, sweat dripping down her spine. Each step felt heavier, as if the desert itself was questioning her resolve. She gripped the journal, flipping to the sketched map, her finger tracing the circled shaft. "It should be here," she whispered, though no one could hear her. Hours later, the sand gave way to a crumbled depression in the earth. Broken stones jutted from the ground like jagged teeth. She crouched, brushing aside dust to reveal the mouth of a collapsed shaft. Her breath hitched. It was exactly where the journal said it would be. Excitement surged, but so did dread. Alone, without permits, she was trespassing on dangerous ground. One misstep, one landslide, and she could vanish into the desert like countless nameless explorers before her. She pulled back, heart hammering. That was when she heard voices. Eliza Marlowe? She turned sharply. Two men stood behind her, their khaki uniforms marked with the insignia of the Antiquities Authority. One, tall, with a sharp jawline, eyed her with suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," he said, in clipped English. Eliza's throat went dry. I was just..." The second man smirked, arms crossed. "A student? Playing explorer?" The words cut deep, echoing Crane's mockery. Heat flushed her cheeks. "I'm researching," she insisted, clutching the journal to her chest. The tall man extended his hand. "Permit," she faltered. "I don't have one." His eyes hardened. "Then you leave. Now." Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to tell them about the erased cartouche, the alignment with Sirius, the queen erased from history. But their faces told her the truth. They had already dismissed her. To them, she was no different from a tourist with delusions. As they turned to walk away, she caught the taller man muttering under his breath in Arabic. Though her skills were rusty, she understood enough. Another foolish girl chasing ghosts. Her fists clenched. The humiliation in Crane's lecture hall replayed, doubled now by the scorn of these officials. She could almost hear the professor's voice in her head, dripping with derision. Wild fantasies. But beneath the humiliation, something harder crystallized. "If they won't believe me, I'll prove it myself." That night, back in her hotel room, she collapsed onto the bed, journal open before her. Frustration boiled in her chest. She had the evidence, the sight, the conviction, but the gatekeepers of history barred her path, just as they had barred her grandfather's might. Her phone buzzed. A message from a classmate lit the screen. "Saw the Crane incident online. He really humiliated you. Sorry, Eliza." She stared at it, anger flaring. Even half a world away, his laughter reached her. She typed nothing in reply. Instead, she returned to the journal, tracing her grandfather's sketches again and again, as if his hand might guide hers from beyond. One note caught her eye. "When walls rise, dig deeper." She exhaled sharply. The words weren't just about archaeology. They were about life, about facing the scorn of the world. Her decision solidified. The authorities could scoff. The professor could laugh. None of them mattered. Tomorrow, she would return not as a student seeking permission, but as a granddaughter answering a legacy. And if the desert chose to test her, she would not turn back. The desert before dawn was not silent, it breathed. The wind skimmed the dunes in low whispers, carrying grains of sand that stung Eliza's cheeks as she trudged toward the southern edge of Saqqara once again. Her backpack was light: a rope coil, a flashlight, a small crowbar, and the leather-bound journal that never left her side. The Antiquities Authority would never grant her a permit, so she had no choice but to work in secrecy. Her heart pounded as she reached the collapsed shaft. In the dim light, it looked like the gaping mouth of some ancient beast, hungry for those reckless enough to disturb it. Eliza crouched low, brushing aside debris, her hands trembling. Her grandfather's map had marked this place with urgency, almost desperation. She set the rope against a sturdy rock and tied it with deliberate knots. "This is madness," she whispered to herself, hearing Crane's voice echo in her head. Fairy tales, wild fantasies, ghosts. But beneath the fear surged a fiercer voice, her grandfather's. "The sand remembers." With one last glance at the horizon, Eliza lowered herself into the darkness. The air shifted instantly, cooler and damp with the scent of stone long hidden. Her flashlight beam carved a thin tunnel through the black, illuminating walls of limestone etched with faint marks. She brushed her fingers across them, heart skipping, when she saw traces of hieroglyphs worn nearly smooth. Most were illegible, but one symbol stood clear: a star. Sirius. She gasped. The alignment wasn't just above ground. It was inscribed here, proof that the shaft was tied to celestial patterns. Her grandfather had been right, but as she ventured deeper, the shaft narrowed, forcing her to crawl. Dust choked her lungs, and shards of rock scraped her arms. The beam flickered, making shadows leap against the walls like specters. Her chest tightened with panic. What if it collapses? What if I die here and no one ever finds me? She froze, her breath ragged. For a moment, she almost turned back. Then she saw the words scrawled faintly in the dirt wall, carved perhaps centuries ago. A cartouche, its oval nearly erased, but faintly visible. Inside it, fragments of symbols remained enough to suggest a royal name. Her hand trembled as she traced the lines. Whoever this queen had been, someone had gone to great lengths to strike her from memory. Yet here, hidden in the darkness, her name had survived in ghostly fragments. Eliza's voice cracked as she whispered, "You're real." Pushing forward, she found the shaft widened into a small chamber blocked by fallen stone. Her light caught the edge of an inscription partially visible beneath the rubble. With shaking hands, she pried loose a chunk of limestone. The sound echoed like thunder in the silence. Slowly, words emerged, a dedication in hieroglyphs that chilled her blood. "Beloved of Isis, ruler of two lands, she who was erased." Eliza sank to her knees, tears burning her eyes. It wasn't just rumor. The queen her grandfather had sought, the queen Crane had laughed at, was here. Hidden, silenced, but not gone. Her flashlight flickered again, casting strange shapes against the chamber walls. For the first time, Eliza felt the weight of her trespass. This wasn't simply archaeology, it was a violation, an intrusion into a tomb deliberately concealed. Fear, laced with awe, ran down her spine. Suddenly, a faint sound behind her made her freeze. A pebble shifting, a scrape against stone. She turned sharply, light quivering across the shaft. Nothing, just silence, pressing close, thick, and suffocating. But the fear didn't send her back. It rooted her deeper. If anything, it sharpened her resolve. The world had mocked her, dismissed her, shut her out. But here, in this forbidden place, she had touched truth no one else dared to believe. Clutching the journal, she whispered to the darkness, "I'll finish what you started, grandfather. I'll bring her back." The queen was waiting, and Eliza had just stepped into her forbidden kingdom. The chamber smelled of dust and secrets, a stagnant air that had not been disturbed in centuries. Eliza's flashlight beam trembled across the limestone, settling on the inscription she had uncovered. "Beloved of Isis, ruler of two lands, she who was erased." The words made her throat tighten. a ruler so feared, so hated, that her very name had been carved from history. Yet here she was, whispering back through time. Eliza's hands shook as she cleared more rubble. The limestone blocks gave way reluctantly, scraping and grinding as if the tomb itself resisted her intrusion. Sweat streaked her face, her fingernails cracked, but finally she uncovered a faint seam in the wall, an outline of a doorway sealed tight. Her grandfather had marked it in his journal, but seeing it with her own eyes stole her breath. She traced the hieroglyphs along the edge, her light-catching symbols of protection. Jackals, ankhs, serpents, coiled in warning. The ancients had not sealed this place casually. They had entombed it with the intent that no one should ever return. Her mind swirled. What if Crane was right? What if I'm chasing madness? Yet even as the thought flickered, she knew it was false. The professor's laughter had always been armor for his arrogance, not truth. And her grandfather's words burned brighter now than ever. Stone does not lie. The sand remembers. She leaned her forehead against the wall, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. Then she noticed something else. Tiny holes cut into the limestone at intervals, a pattern of ventilation shafts disguised in the carvings. Whoever built this chamber had designed it with care, as if expecting someone to one day return. Her chest surged with hope. This was no coincidence. This was invitation. She wedged the crowbar into the seam, muscles straining as she pried. The crack widened slowly, a low groan echoing through the chamber as stone yielded, dust billowed, choking her throat. At last, the walls split just enough for her light to pierce the darkness beyond. The beam revealed a narrow passage lined with painted reliefs. Despite the centuries, the colors clung stubbornly. Deep reds, lapis blues, gold leaf that flickered like fire under her light. Figures marched across the walls, soldiers, priestesses, servants carrying offerings, but at the center of each panel was a single woman, tall, crowned, her face sharp and commanding. Eliza's breath caught. "It's her," she whispered. "The queen." She crawled through the opening, her knees scraping against stone, until she emerged into a chamber that stole every word from her tongue. The room opened wide, its ceiling soaring higher than she expected. Pillars carved with lotus motifs lined the space, each one etched with the queen's likeness, though her name was violently scratched away. At the far end, an altar lay toppled, its offerings scattered and looted long ago. But the sarcophagus remained. It dominated the center, massive and black as obsidian, its lid covered in protective spells. Her light trembled across its surface, catching faint flecks of gold. Eliza staggered closer, tears streaming freely. She had done it. Her grandfather had been right. She pressed her hands against the cold stone. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the silence seep into her bones. "You're not forgotten," she whispered. "Not anymore." Yet even in triumph, fear prickled at her spine. What would happen if she revealed this? The authorities would accuse her of trespassing, perhaps destroy her credibility forever. And Crane, his scorn would turn to fury if she presented evidence that shattered his authority. Still, she knew she couldn't turn back. This wasn't about reputation. This was about truth. And truth demanded light. The flashlight beam swept across the walls again, pausing on a final inscription above the sarcophagus. The hieroglyphs spelled out a warning: "Let no man speak her name, lest his kingdom fall." Eliza shivered. The ancients hadn't just erased this queen, they had cursed her memory. Her internal voice faltered. "What have I unleashed?" But then her grandfather's memory rose again, steady as the desert stars. History belongs to those who dare to write it. Eliza wiped her tears, her resolve hardening like stone. She pulled out her camera, snapping photo after photo. Hieroglyphs, murals, the sarcophagus, all carefully documented. Evidence Crane could never laugh away. In that moment, she didn't feel like a student anymore. She felt like the queen herself, standing against centuries of silence, daring to be remembered. And above the desert, dawn broke, spilling gold across the sands as though Egypt itself acknowledged her discovery. News traveled faster than sandstorms. Eliza hadn't told anyone, but secrets that powerful had a way of slipping into the world. Within a week, whispers leaked through Cairo's academic circles. A student, they said, had stumbled onto something extraordinary. A tomb, a queen. At first, most scoffed. Students don't make discoveries. Students chase fantasies. But then photographs began to circulate, grainy, hurried shots of murals, cartouches, the obsidian sarcophagus. By the time Eliza returned to the city, the storm had already reached Professor Aldous Crane. He sat in his office surrounded by his books, his polished oak desk immaculate as always, when a colleague thrust a tablet before him. On the screen, Eliza's photographs. Crane's face drained of color, the cartouche fragments, the sarcophagus. The evidence was undeniable. "No," he muttered. His throat tightened, heat flooding his face. "It's impossible. She's fabricating. She must be." But even as denial coiled inside him, a deeper dread took root. He recognized the shaft. He had dismissed it himself years ago, echoing his mentor's arrogance. His own notes, tucked away in his archives, described it as collapsed rubble, of no significance. Now a student had gone where he had not dared, and history itself was shifting under his feet. When reporters cornered him outside the lecture hall, microphones thrust toward his face, Crane forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "I assure you, Miss Marlowe's claims are premature. Amateur work, likely misinterpretation." His words came out smooth, but his hands shook behind his back. Meanwhile, Eliza stood before the Antiquities Authority, her voice steady though her palms sweated. The officials, who had once dismissed her as a foolish girl, now leaned forward, their eyes sharp with interest. She laid out her grandfather's journal, the star alignments, the inscriptions. Every detail matched. The chamber was real, the queen undeniable. The same tall official who had scoffed at her weeks earlier spoke now with reverence. "You understand this changes everything, Miss Marlowe. If authenticated, this will be the first recorded discovery of a deliberately erased queen of Egypt." Eliza swallowed hard. She deserves to be remembered. Her words, though quiet, carried weight. The authority agreed to begin a sanctioned excavation. Yet even as they prepared, rumors swirled about Crane. Scholars debated whether he had ignored evidence, whether his arrogance had blinded him. At night, Crane sat alone in his office, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The laughter he had wielded so easily against his students now echoed back at him, hollow and cruel. "I laughed because I was afraid," he admitted in the silence. "Afraid of being wrong, afraid of being small, afraid that truth could come from someone beneath him." For the first time in decades, doubt gnawed at him. He remembered Eliza's face in the lecture hall, flushed with humiliation but burning with defiance. He had thought he crushed her. Instead, he had forged her resolve. When the official announcement came, the world erupted. Headlines blazed. "Lost Egyptian Queen Unearthed." Scholars scrambled to rewrite timelines. Documentaries rushed into production. And in every article, one name appeared: Eliza Marlowe. Crane could not escape it. He saw her name on television, in newspapers, on the lips of his students who once worshipped him. Each mention was a blade twisting deeper. The power he had built on certainty was crumbling. Finally, he requested a private audience. Eliza entered his office, the air thick with unspoken history. She carried herself differently now, not arrogant, but unshaken. Her grandfather's journal clasped in her hand like a relic. Crane rose, but his usual commanding presence faltered. His voice cracked. "You found it." Eliza met his gaze, calm and steady. "She was there all along. You just refused to see." The silence that followed was heavier than any lecture he had ever given. Crane's throat tightened as humiliation burned him from within. For the first time in his career, he had no clever retort, no dismissive laugh. only a truth that stripped him bare. He had been wrong, and the student he mocked had been right. And in that silence, Eliza realized something profound. His shame was not her victory. The true victory belonged to the queen, whose story now rose from the sand. Months later, the desert breathed a different song. Where once there had been only dunes and silence, now tents and scaffolding rose like skeletal guardians over the tomb of the forgotten queen. Archaeologists, students, and officials bustled in the sun, their voices mixing with the clang of tools and the shuffle of brushes against stone. Cameras from international news outlets recorded every detail. What had begun as a secret in her grandfather's journal had become a discovery and rewriting history. Eliza stood at the edge of the excavation site, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the heat. In her hands, she held the leather-bound journal, its worn edges now preserved in a protective case. Every day, as she watched the teams carefully uncover artifacts, she thought of him, her grandfather, who had died branded as an eccentric, dismissed by the very men who now hailed him as a visionary through her. The chamber had revealed treasures beyond imagining. Golden amulets depicting the goddess Isis, fragments of scrolls detailing rituals, murals showing a queen commanding armies. The queen's sarcophagus, when finally opened under the watch of international experts, revealed inscriptions naming her as Neferet Aset, the fierce beloved of Isis. Her story had been erased because she had dared to seize power in her own right, challenging male dynasties. Eliza felt the weight of that revelation in her chest. This wasn't just about proving Crane wrong. It was about restoring the voice of a woman silenced by history, giving her back the dignity stolen from her memory. Professor Crane stood among the observers that day, though he looked smaller than she remembered. His hair, once immaculately combed, now fell in weary strands. When their eyes met, he offered no sneer, no mocking laughter. Instead, he gave a faint nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. Humility had replaced arrogance, though it had come at a cost. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in fire and shadow, Eliza walked alone through the site. The air was cooler now, the wind stirring sand around her ankles. She paused before the entrance to the chamber, staring at the hieroglyphs her grandfather had once sketched in desperation. Now, they were illuminated with spotlights, preserved for the world to see. She whispered into the dusk, "You're remembered now, both of you." Her eyes stung with tears, but they were not born of grief alone. They carried relief, triumph, and something more: clarity. She had spent months chasing proof, driven by humiliation and the need to be heard. But standing here, she realized the lesson was larger than her struggle or Crane's downfall. History had always been fragile, vulnerable to the pens of those in power. But truth carved into stone, truth buried in sand, outlasted arrogance. It waited for someone bold enough to listen. Weeks later, the official reports named Eliza Marlowe as the lead discoverer of the tomb of Queen Neferet Aset. Universities extended offers. Documentaries requested interviews. The world called her a prodigy. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw not a prodigy, but a granddaughter who had honored a promise. Her life had changed, yes, but the deeper change had come for those who once believed themselves untouchable. Professor Crane retired quietly at the end of the semester. In one of his last lectures, he confessed to his students, "Arrogance blinds us. Sometimes the truest scholars are those we dismiss as dreamers." The classroom, once his kingdom, had become his confessional. For Eliza, the journey did not end at Saqqara. She knew there were other silenced voices, other names erased from walls and scrolls waiting to be unearthed. The discovery of Neferet Aset was not the climax, it was the beginning, a call to continue listening to the whispers beneath the sand. As the excavation site faded into twilight, Eliza placed her hand on the journal's cover one last time, before sealing it in its case. "Thank you, grandfather," she murmured. "We did it." And as the desert stars bloomed overhead, aligning in ancient patterns, she felt certain that both her grandfather and the queen were at peace. Moral lesson: in the end, arrogance may silence voices for a time, but truth endures. Humility, patience, and courage reveal what pride tries to bury. History belongs not to those who mock, but to those who dare to listen. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.